Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
Welcome to Jeffrey Dahmer MKULTRA and the Occult Part 4, where we will cover Jeff's confession, his trial, and his death. The statements given about this confession, how it was completely truthful, and Jeff just wanted to get everything out there, and it was so accurate with all the details he gave, is simply false, and really a blatant lie for anyone who has actually read this document. So, what does his initial confession state? I'm going to jump in here because it might get a little boring looking at page after page of his confession, and I have to show you the exact pages so no one can doubt what I'm saying. Now again, a lot of things are discussed in the confession, and if they are important they will surely be mentioned, but there is much to be left in the background. Here we want to focus on the murders, and the details Jeff gives that are supposed to prove his guilt. If he, and he alone, committed these crimes, the discrepancies should be kept to a minimum, as he simply has to recall his own memory. This is not what happens, of course, as Jeff will request day after day to speak with detectives with new details that makes you wonder how he forgot those details in the first place, and how exactly it only occurred to him later to mention these details, some literally including the murders he's only supposed to have committed just weeks ago. Anyway, let's get into it. What does his very first confession, before any of the revisions, say? He lists out 11 different killings, though the details are vague and no names are mentioned. He confesses he killed a 19-year-old when he was 18 back in Bath, Ohio. They had sex, and when the man wanted to leave, he killed him with a barbell upon a single strike. He then went to the Army for 3 years, and upon being discharged, he stayed in Florida for a year where nothing happened. He confirms this timing 3 more times, saying he left Florida for Ohio in March 1982. Even though in Lionel's book it states he was arrested in September 1981, in his mugshot for an unexplainable reason states July 1981, Bath, Ohio. But let's stick with the very first confession for now. After leaving Florida, he moved to Milwaukee to live with his grandma, where he was around 23, making it by or past May 1983, when he would move in with his grandma in West Allis. He then mentions killing a man at the Ambassador, where he woke up to find him bleeding from his mouth. From here, Dahmer's killing spree began. Though before he gets to the rest of the killings, he wanted to specify that not all of his sexual encounters with men were violent, and that he had plenty of consensual encounters with no violence. Continuing on, he would state that he took the man in the basement of his grandmother's house, where he would dismember him by the floor drain. He would do the same with his next victim about 2 months later, an 18-year-old Hispanic male he drugged and dismembered and threw in the trash. A month after this, he strangled a 20-year-old mulatto he met at Takach and again dismembered him in the basement of his grandmother's and smashed his bones with a sledgehammer. A whole year would go by and his next victim would be a 19-year-old Hispanic male. Next, he would move into apartment 204 in the residence located at 808 North 24th Street. After, as Jeff would say, taking pictures of a minor, he would spend a year on work release from the House of Corrections. Next, after 6 months at his grandmother's house, he would finally move into 213 at the Oxford. Both of Dahmer's apartment numbers equate to 6, by the way. And of course, the room Dahmer is interviewing in, room 411, equates to 6 as well. Wintertime rolls around, and Dahmer would take his first victim at the Oxford, a 24-year-old black man he met in front of the bookstore. He would take him to the apartment, drug him, and stab him in the neck, dismembering him in the bathtub, and then taking the defleshed bones and acidifying them in a plastic container. 3 days later, taking the liquid and dumping it down the toilet. Of course, bone fragments would remain, and the acid would damage the pipes, but let's continue. 2 months later, he would meet a 20-year-old black man, drugging, dismembering, and disposing of him. 1 month later, at the C'est La Vie, he would take a 26-year-old black man home and victimize him as well. 6 months later in Chicago, now he would meet a 20-year-old black man, taking him home on the bus. But before this, he would meet a Chinese male at the mall, 15 years old, in May or June. Taking a bus back to the apartment, he would have the boy pose for photos before drugging and dismembering him as well, doing the same with the 20-year-old black male from Chicago. The head in the fridge gets no timeline, just that he was 25 years old and he met him on the streets. As of the recording of the confession, Jeff states he bought the 57-gallon drum a month ago and began placing body parts in it. On exactly July 19, 1991, he met a white male around 25 years old near Marquette University. After having sexual relations with him, he drugged, strangled, dismembered, and acidified him. The head in the fridge could be identified by the ID of his that Jeff carried in his wallet, even though earlier Jeff stated he destroyed all of the IDs. The white male he met at the bus stop also had his ID in Jeff's possession back at his apartment. His last attempted victim, he would pay $20 to come back to his apartment for photos. After placing a handcuff on one of the man's wrists, he ran out and alerted the police. Quote, subject states he is not sure what happened next because he was drunk. And so goes Jeff Dahmer's very first confession, taken during a period of around 6 hours the night of his arrest, starting at 1:30 a.m. and ending at 7:15. Doesn't seem too off from what actually happened, right? Some of the discrepancies could be blamed on his drunkenness, perhaps? No. Though Dahmer turned over from requesting a lawyer to going against his lawyer's advice and confessing, his wish to put the truth out on the table would be hindered by the fact Dahmer can't remember what he did. The order in which events happened for Jeff is so out of accordance with the supposed true events, they could not be blamed simply on his chronic alcoholism. Starting off, he puts the killing of Steve Tuomi, the man he only remembers for being the one he killed at the Ambassador, in the summer of 1984, making the preceding events short by 3 whole years. Placing this in the summer also takes the following murders out of the month they truly happened in. The first 3 murders that happened while he was staying at his grandmother's house would now be placed in the heat of summer versus the snowfall of winter. The murders were also out of order, as he puts Sears, which as he called the mulatto, before the Hispanic male he killed a year later, which we could presume would be Richard Guerrero. In reality, of course, Dahmer is supposed to have killed Tuomi in November 1987, James Doxtator in January 1988, and Richard Guerrero in March 1988. He also skips over the first 2 victims at the Oxford, one of which was a person Dahmer photographed extensively and knew for weeks or months. He also put his stay at the 808 apartments for an entire year, but we will go over that shortly. The killing of Ernest Miller, who we can identify by the way in which he was killed, that being a cut to the neck, was placed by Jeff in the winter of 1989 when he was in reality staying in the House of Corrections at that time. Again, Jeff doesn't mention a single name throughout the entire confession. If the detectives never came up with a single name, they would be left with a bunch of John Does in Dahmer's apartment, aside from the ones that had their IDs kept by Dahmer. He also places his stay in Florida for a whole year, when in reality it was supposedly only a few months. Although Jeff may have had some flawed memories here and there, he can truly assure us that no such activity happened in Florida or in Germany, even though Dahmer completely forgets to mention the body he found behind the dumpster of the sub shop he was working at. And he also forgets to mention more than a few victims. Most clearly Jeremiah Weinberger, who Dahmer had killed only weeks ago and had formed a bond with within the short time that he knew him. The reason for this level of forgetfulness I will leave to your discretion, but it gets worse. Here's a quote from Lionel Dahmer's book, A Father's Story. On the very first day of his new life, Jeff approached a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Somsak Sinthanson and took him to his new place, apartment 204 on North 24th Street in Milwaukee. And we are very aware of what happens next. Dahmer, on the other hand, maybe not so much. He places his stay at the 808 apartments not lasting a single day, as Lionel might have it, but an entire year. How can one confuse a single day for an entire year? The next day on the 24th, less than a day later, this would be one of the details that Dahmer changes. He then states he stayed there 6 months to a year. When exactly it became a single day is unclear in the confession, but many other things begin to change as well, as we will see. After the initial 6-hour confession, he wanted to sit and talk with the detectives a little more, where we get the statement from Jeff that he felt he last seen his father in 1979. I thought this might be a typo and it was supposed to be 1989, but even this would mean that Jeff completely blanked out on the Thanksgiving he supposedly spent with Lionel and Sherry at his apartment in 1990. But no, Murphy repeats this date on the stand in his testimony. In the same confession, we again get Jeff confirming he and Hicks had sexual relations and he killed Hicks with a single strike of the barbell. Normally these would be indelible events in most people's minds, you know, whether you had sex with someone and well, for most this won't apply hopefully, but the method with which you killed someone, probably details most would find hard to mistake. But Dahmer apparently did so, changing his story less than 24 hours later from having sex with Hicks to not having sex with Hicks. A few days down the road, he would even change the single strike with a barbell to him hitting him with the barbell and then strangling him. I'm not exactly sure how you might one day be confident in the fact that you struck someone and with the single blow killed them to strangling them, but again, Dahmer was just so thorough. Everyone just had to believe him. Still on this same conversation taking place the night of his arrest, he again states he stayed in Florida for an entire year. He then states he stayed in Bath for 4 months before moving into his grandma's in Milwaukee, placing this move in June or July of 1982 when, in reality, he moved there in December of 1981. Winter weather and the atmosphere of the holidays was once again confused with the warm days of summer. But soon after this, Jeff calls it a night and was soon taken to the city jail at 10:30 a.m., meaning the detectives sat with Dahmer for 9 hours straight, and this is the information that they got. This is how Dahmer's first ever confession is rendered. In a time in which he sat with detectives for 9 hours in total, he gets key details completely wrong. In 9 whole hours, he forgets to mention 6 of his victims. 9 hours. And on top of that, he was given coffee and cigarettes, which are both nootropics and stimulants. Higher energy, more focus, and better access to memory, which we know Jeff has a problem with. In all that time, he somehow manages to forget a person he killed just weeks ago. I'll try not to repeat myself too much, but I really want to stress how important that is because, as we will see the next day, Dahmer sits down with detectives and somehow remembers all the rest of the victims. After the last talk, Dahmer was taken to the city jail. So from here on, he would request to speak with the detectives, and they would have to drop what they were doing to come to speak with him. As per the confession, we are still on the 23rd. Dahmer requests to speak with the detectives, which initially seems like 2 more times on that day, but it is likely 2 reports from the same interview, which began at 1:15 p.m., where he states, "I've told you everything already. I have nothing to hide, so I might as well tell you about these ones I forgot." Where he states one of the victims was a 25-year-old Hispanic male he met at Carol's bar 2 weeks ago. Why it took Dahmer multiple sessions with the detectives before he could remember killing someone just 2 weeks ago, I have no clear answer for beyond speculation. He states the victim stayed with him around 2 days and he couldn't remember his name, but he thinks it may have been Tony. He also recalls another murder which took place just 5 months ago, but again, Dahmer is just now remembering this murder. Still, we have not gotten a single name except for the incorrect guess of Tony. He once again confirms he stayed in Florida for a year, and then, within a less than 24-hour time span, he changes his story to say the killings actually began in 1987 instead of 1984. And so this is how the very first day of Dahmer's confession went. We will not cover the entire confession, but we will cover the rest of the victims and the initial details Dahmer gives that, in my opinion, completely discredits him, and thus the confession should not have been used to throw out the guilt phase of the trial. With that, let's begin the second day of confessions, which begins at 8:30 a.m. the next day. Without initially detailing the month or even the year in which he killed Stephen Hicks, he later goes on to say it was in October. We know now this killing actually took place in the summer, June to be precise, and we know this was supposed to take place when no one else was home. By August, Lionel found the situation Jeff was living in and moved back into the house. By October, Jeff would be enrolled in Ohio State. In less than 24 hours, he would also change his tune on the sexual interaction he claimed he and Hicks had, confirming that he indeed did not have sex with Hicks. But for now, he still sticks with the single strike of the barbell being the death of Stephen Hicks. And as I have actually just read, the barbell story only changes when the name of Hicks is actually produced, which is on the 26th, 3 days after Jeff's initial confession. This is after the detectives produced the name Stephen Hicks, to which Dahmer confirmed that that was the victim's name because you never forget your first. This is after he was unable to recall his name for the first 3 days and never produced the name himself. They then showed him a, quote, reproduction of the photograph of Stephen Hicks, where Dahmer definitively confirmed he was the man. We all know the shape the facts of the case took on later in the books and shows and documentaries, but this all comes after drastic changes to Jeff's initial story. We went over his initial confession, but most of the details come the next day on the 24th. At approximately 4:20 p.m., we sat with Jeffrey in room 407 of the Detective Bureau and gave him cigarettes, coffee, and soda, and questioned him regarding the Polaroid photographs that he had taken of the homicide victims in an attempt to make identifications of these individuals and to establish an order of the homicides and what had actually occurred. Mr. Dahmer stated that he would be glad to cooperate in any way. So begins the 9 pages of Jeff's confession on the 24th that begets the entire list of victims that for whatever reason Jeff could not remember the day previous, again forgetting about murders he committed just weeks before. We are not going to go into the minute details, but we will follow the timeline laid out for us by Jeff. There is plenty in this confession that simply goes against what we already know, but on the surface there is plenty to discredit his statements. One day in the future I might do an entire video going over the confession, but for now we will go over the incredible mistakes Jeff makes about his own life. In this 9-page confession, his timeline is initiated in 1984 or 1985 with the death of Tuomi, but slowly the timeline begins to match towards the end of his killing spree. Still, large discrepancies linger as he states he killed his first victim at the Oxford 2 months after his arrival, when in reality it was within less than a week of him moving in. There is no mention of the previous relationships he had with certain victims, and he offers no names as he cannot recall them, and only confirms victims and names after detectives produce more information. The facts would then begin to take on a certain shape after Dahmer took responsibility for the murders of multiple missing people. Though the initial details were far from the truth, the detectives determined those discrepancies were small enough to look over. Getting dates wrong, confusing a day for an entire year, offering no names, and confusing winter for summer on multiple occasions. He would change key details in a short span of time and completely forget to mention the multiple homicides he was supposed to be responsible for. 6 of the victims go unmentioned, these offenses being committed just weeks ago. Why the wait? Why was this information not readily available to the man who just committed these offenses? During a 9-hour time span, Dahmer couldn't account for things he did as drastic as murder. How do we account for that? How do we account for him confusing his less than a day stay at the 808 for an entire year? Alcohol can affect memory, but I've never heard of it expanding a day into an entire year. How do we account for Dahmer forgetting all of the interactions he had with his father over the years, and his last known memory of being with Lionel dating back to 1979? I could make a whole video going over all of the odd and inconsistent details I found within the confession, but I think this is enough to show that the idea that Dahmer was so prodigious in his ability to recall the crimes, and he just felt the weight of the burden to confess, not even for the families, but for his own selfish desire to clear his conscience, is false. He may have wished with all his desire to confess, but in 9 whole hours he could not come up with the most relevant details that would be hard to explain how they would escape him in that time span. But of course, each time the detectives would go away and come back, Dahmer had remembered new details. Let me know what you think so far. Why do you think Jeff's memory is so flawed? How he was unable to come up with these details in 9 whole hours? And another odd thing, why was the confession not taped but instead selectively written down by the interviewing detectives who interviewed Dahmer for over 60 hours? Imagine the things Dahmer said in those hours that will never be heard. Surely key details were divulged that we will never be privy to. Regardless, what is on paper is enough to raise suspicion as high as it goes in regards to Jeff's full and total responsibility for each and every one of the crimes he says he committed. One last thing before we move into the trial, which skipped the guilt phase as Jeff's flawed confession served to prove that he was the guilty party for each of the bodies in his apartment. He and he alone was responsible by his own admission. So the part where they actually look into every aspect of the case to determine who was guilty, yeah, they just skipped that part. But anyway, the thing I want to mention located in the confession has to do with the death of Ernest Miller. If you will remember, Miller is killed more violently than the others. Jeff stabbed him in the neck, and as previously described, this would have made a mess. Well, not that long after this man's death, Lionel and Sherry were given a tour of Jeff's apartment on Thanksgiving in 1990, and they claimed the place was spotless. Well, as it turned out, blood still stained the walls and mattress at the time of Jeff's arrest. Who does this blood belong to? Well, none other than Ernest Miller. How can Jeff's apartment be said to have been spotless when the blood of the man he killed almost a year ago still stained the walls upon his arrest? Of course, Lionel and Sherry had to say that there was nothing there, when Jeff's own confession and the physical evidence of his statement that there was indeed blood on the wall completely disproves their claim. What do you think? Are they lying? Did they know more than they say? All of Jeff's behavior right under their noses. I mean, dang, the smell and the blood on the wall, well, they just didn't notice it, I guess. And one other thing I want to mention before we move into the trial is something I only recently noticed. Do we recall when Sopa testified and said he checked on the smell for the first time in August 1990? In this same statement is when he places the incident where the police were called and actually kicked down the door of another tenant, that it was related to them trying to find the source of the smell. As far as we can tell, this all happened in August. They make no mention that the police came sooner, or in late May or early June when Dahmer's last victim might have actually still been in the apartment. Yet in multiple sources when this incident is mentioned, where the police kicked down the door to another tenant simply because the smell was so clearly the smell of death, Jeff is stated to have been in the middle of cutting up one of his victims or had half a torso in the tub. Notice how they never say the victim either when they easily could, as by that time there are only 2 victims, Cash D and Eddie Smith. But these guys were killed in May, when as it is stated at the time of this event, which is by all indications placed in August, Dahmer had a body in the tub. Again, no mention of who it is, it's just a body. Well, as we know, Dahmer did not kill anyone in August. If everything here is true, then that means an entire victim has never been identified or acknowledged all of this time. That is, if Dahmer is being truthful in his statement that there was indeed a body in his tub. Maybe I'm reading it wrong and this is all just one big misunderstanding. And the police did indeed come in May or June, but again, no mention is made that they came that early. But whenever they do come, Dahmer has a body in his apartment. Anyway, I just had to point that out. We will now move into the trial that is largely built upon the confession you just seen. Like I said, I figured it would be boring to just stare at page after page, but now we will go back to our regular style. Okay, I need to make a clarification as I just reread the confession and I got some numbers confused. There were 11 different bodies found in Jeff's apartment, but Jeff actually confessed to 12 separate killings, not 11. Each part of the text that is highlighted is a separate victim. I never want to spread false information, so if I get anything wrong, like this part, I'll make sure to set the record straight.
We found 3 skulls that were spray painted with this gray granite-like texture paint, and I was impressed with how professional they looked, and it was hard for me to conceive of these being skeletonized remains because they didn't appear to be that. And it wasn't until my assistant, Dr. Takach, had taken out his pocket knife and removed some of the paint that we could see on the teeth. We could actually see that there was enamel on the teeth. And that was the first time that I fully realized that we had additional 3 bodies because those were, human skulls.
While Jeff was finding a way to confess and remembering new details with each new conversation with detectives, the remains in his apartment were being analyzed to confirm the identities of the victims. Again, never offering a name himself, Jeff simply confirmed or denied his involvement with the person the detectives presented to him. Many of the skulls in the apartment were tied to the dental records of some of the missing victims. 7 skulls were found, leaving 4 of the remains to be identified by other means. Fingerprints were taken from those who could not otherwise be identified by dental records, and wouldn't you know, they were able to identify remains via fingerprint analysis of weeks to months old corpses. Findings today prove this task to be beyond challenging, yet somehow back in 1991, they managed the impossible. Dahmer also managed the impossible, as the items found in Jeff's apartment list many chemicals harmful to humans without the proper equipment, the most obvious being muriatic acid. Yet not once is any personal protective equipment listed among Dahmer's possessions, making it extremely improbable Dahmer could have used these chemicals in the sense they claim he did. Regardless, all of this went unquestioned as Dahmer had the bodies in his apartment, so he and he alone must be guilty. I will now go through the events that took place in court, but fair warning, I am no legal expert. Anyway, let's begin with Jeff's first appearance in court. 3 days after Jeff's arrest, he makes his first appearance in court. By now, most of Jeff's confession has been rendered, and many of the victims identified. Sat next to Boyle, Jeff simply acknowledges the charges brought against him.
Mr. Dahmer, you're charged with 4 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. If convicted of each of those counts, you face a term of life imprisonment. You're also charged with habitual criminality. That would add an additional 10-year penalty to each count upon conviction. Do you understand that?
I understand, Your Honor.
On August 6th, 15 days after Jeff's arrest, Gerald Boyle determines the evidence gathered is not necessary and, as he says, it should be released to the discretion of Dr. Jensen.
And that would be waived, obviously, if there is nothing there to test. that he wishes to have those parts released and not be retained. I would furthermore state for the record that I have this date contacted. If one reads the criminal complaint, much of the identification is done by a forensic odontologist. I am confident that that odontologist has retained sufficient information for which somebody in the future need be, or if that time ever came, can review his work product, determine whether or not he is correct in his conclusions and opinions. I have no reason at this time to proffer why Dr. Jensen has to retain anything further, and obviously, therefore, they can use their own discretion in returning whatever they wish to return to the members of the family.
I'm no legal scholar in any way, but from what I gather and what I've read, this is effectively discontinuing further study of the physical evidence and sticking with what was already discovered. With the confession and Jeff's admittance of acting alone by this time, this would effectively seal Dahmer into being the only perpetrator. The thing is, and again, I will stress, I am no legal expert, but it seems as though this actually violates a Wisconsin law regarding ongoing trials. By this time, Jeff has not put in any formal plea, and again, this is only 15 days after Dahmer's arrest. I'll put the law in full on screen so you can pause to read. Given that Boyle even suggested this would mean that the investigation into Dahmer's crimes were complete just 15 days after his arrest. In Dahmer's first court appearance, McCann states he hopes the investigation will be complete by the 6th, only so they can bring additional charges against Dahmer.
I do further wish to advise the court and ask leave of the court on July 6th, 1991, August 6th, 1991, to file an amended complaint. This investigation is not complete. As the court will recollect from the affidavit that was filed yesterday, there's a mention of 11 skulls. The investigation is not complete. It's continuing by the police, and it is our hope that by August 6th, 1991, we will have completed the investigation and be in a position to file an amended complaint that will contain additional counts of homicide.
After letting Dahmer make his confession and requesting the physical evidence be released, Boyle also decided to skip the preliminary hearing.
You have the right to a preliminary hearing. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do.
Is it correct that you wish to waive or give up your right to have a preliminary hearing in this case?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Is this your signature on the form telling me that's what you would like to do?
That's my signature.
At the time that you signed this form, was it your understanding that what you would be doing this morning is giving up just your right to have this hearing and nothing else? In other words, you are not giving up your right to have a trial. Is that understood?
That's right.
The waiver of preliminary hearing has the approval of the court. Defendant is ordered bound over for trial before the circuit court.
Once again, I will stress, I am no legal expert, so I will read to you from justice.gov to explain what a preliminary trial is. Once the defendant has entered a plea of not guilty, a preliminary hearing will often be held. The prosecutor must show that enough evidence exists to charge the defendant. Preliminary hearings are not always required, and the defendant can choose to waive it. It must be held within 14 days of the initial appearance if the defendant is being held in jail. If the defendant is out on bail, it must be scheduled within 21 days of the initial appearance. The preliminary hearing is like a mini trial. The prosecution will call witnesses and introduce evidence, and the defense can cross-examine witnesses. However, the defense cannot object to using certain evidence, and in fact, evidence is allowed to be presented at a preliminary hearing that cannot be shown to a jury at trial. If the judge concludes there is probable cause to believe the crime was committed by the defendant, a trial will soon be scheduled. However, if the judge does not believe the evidence establishes probable cause that the defendant committed the offense, they will dismiss the charges. Well, Dahmer's guilt is so clear that Jeff decides to skip the hearing that would explain the evidence that the prosecution would use to bring charges on Jeff. The confession would be the key piece of evidence, as Dahmer was admitting his own guilt. If the preliminary trial had been held, the confession would be looked at with more scrutiny, and maybe the obvious discrepancies might have come up, or the fact that Jeff was intoxicated upon the initial rendering of his confession. Days later, and still key details and dates are way off, and Dahmer offers no names but only confirms or denies missing persons that detectives place in front of him. Given we only have limited access to case details, surely there are things we are missing that would have been accessible to Dahmer's defense, but it seems they wanted to just get this whole thing over with, not actually determine if Jeff and Jeff alone was solely responsible for the killings. And once again, so we're clear, I am no legal expert, so if I get anything wrong or am presuming something that is not true or goes against the known processes of cases like this, let me know. I mean, I find it odd, but perhaps it's more normal than I think. Regardless, I'll continue to lay out the events as they happened, but the processes behind the events, and the how and why they do the things that they do, I will not act like I am completely knowledgeable about it. September 10th, Dahmer pleads not guilty officially, though by reason of mental disease or defect.
With that in mind, I am therefore prepared to enter the following plea to each of the 15 counts as follows, pursuant to 971.061 paren B and paren D. Defendant Jeffrey Dahmer interposes a plea of not guilty and not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect.
This would soon change, however, and the next time he appears in court, the trial would no longer be about guilt, but sanity.
The next matter is the matter of the guilty pleas, and it is my understanding, sir, from what your attorney has told me, that you desire to change your plea of not guilty to guilty as to each and every one of the various counts in the information. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
And it is the understanding, of course, that the plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect remains. You understand that, sir?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
January 13th, Jeff enters his 15 guilty pleas. Guilty, but insane. Here is where the guilt phase of the trial has effectively been bypassed. No longer did they need to prove Dahmer guilty. Now the prosecution's job will be to prove that he was sane. I will not go through each and every person's testimony here, as this video would be hours long, though there is plenty to find in there that would raise questions about the official accounts of the case. Many of those clips I have shown to you throughout the series. What is important to know is how exactly we got here. Dahmer was found with bodies in his apartment, which he initially did not want to say a word about, but certainly Jeff was aware they would find everything after he witnessed the officers discover the head in the fridge.
I could see a police officer whom I knew. As I walked down there, I noticed that his uniform was in a totally disheveled state, besides perspiration all over, soaking through but that his Sam Browne had been twisted, and that his tie was askew, and his hair was kind of sticking up, and he was sweating profusely, and his eyes were, I mean, they were big. They were as big as saucers. Very unlike Officer Milwaukee. I said, Rolf, what's going on here? And all he could say to me was, go look in the refrigerator.
According to Pat Kennedy, Dahmer initially knew the trouble he was in and in fact requested a lawyer.
I put my hand out, I said, my name is Pat Kennedy. Well, I said, I'm Pat, and I'm the one who's going to be talking to you about the head in the refrigerator. And at that point, he said to me, I really don't think that it's in my best interest to talk to you about this. So to me, that was kind of weird, right? Because if there are no people, it's like, hey, fuck you. You know, I ain't saying shit, right? Yes, people will be defeated. But I had never had anyone, you know, without saying I want a lawyer, which happens a lot, I never had anyone say it quite like that. I mean, very polite and very to the point. Obviously, a command of the English language. I don't think it's in my best interest for me to talk to you about that.
Far from the remorseful killer we are told to believe Jeff was. In fact, Jeff would show regret, though it seems only for being caught.
That also got us into a discussion about alcoholism, because I noticed that he was drunk, and a couple of times during the thing he would blurt out, you know, I can't believe this has happened to me. And I'd say, what are you talking about? He goes, I can't believe I'm sitting here. I can't believe I got caught. And I said, well, what did you think? He goes, well, I just got drunk. He goes, I lost control. I just got drunk. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
Yet suddenly, after he comes to the realization that after they found a head in his fridge, they were going to search the entire apartment, Dahmer began to comply.
So I went back in. I said, hey, Jeff, you know, I said, our forensic guys are out at your apartment, and they're afraid. They're seeing the big five-gallon boxes that say muriatic acid, explosives, dangerous. They're seeing all the electronic devices hooked into your walls, and all of a sudden you could see the realization. He goes, you mean you're in my house, searching my house? And I said, well, if we're not, we're going to, Jeff. I said, of course. I said, there's a homicide there. We're going to go through everything in that house. 3 hours in, we had been talking, 3 hours and 10 minutes in. When he finally said, well, you're going to find out everything now. So it's no sense. I might as well tell you. So I thought, okay, great.
To anyone with common sense, this would already be known. You know, that they were going to find everything after finding a head in the fridge. But as we know, Dahmer has a criminal history, and he even tips off Kennedy to this by making references to things only those familiar with the jailhouse knew.
He started asking me, well, what'll happen to me if I don't talk to you? So I went into kind of a blasé description of our booking process. And as I was describing it, he was kind of nodding, and I could see that he was familiar with the booking process. And then he said to me, he goes, well, there be any way that I'd be able to get my own cell? And as soon as he said that, then I knew he was familiar with the booking process, right? Because the only time people get their own cell, at least in the Milwaukee Police Department at that time, is if they were completely nuts and couldn't be trusted around other people. Or if they were a juvenile and we didn't have a place to hold them until we could put them someplace, they had to be separated. Otherwise, everybody went to the bullpen, which was a disgusting place to be, right? It's stinky and it's smelly and it's packed, and you could be sitting next to a murderer as well as a drunk driver. It was just, and I picked up that he was afraid of the bullpen. And I said, tonight is a very busy night. I think every cell is full and that bullpen is packed. So you can stay here and talk to me. And already he saw that he had a cup of coffee going and the cigarettes. I said, you know, you can go.
So the question remains as to why Jeff, who was in custody for a murder after they found a head in his fridge, would suddenly turn from a non-compliant suspect who knew the workings of the legal system, likely enough to know that they would have probable cause to search the whole place and was still willing to fight from that basis, to someone who just felt the need to confess. But to what exactly, Dahmer would have a hard time saying. Given the bodies in his apartment, but the inability for Jeff to give a full account of his crimes, one might wonder if anyone else might be involved. Sure, Dahmer says he acted alone, but if you can't offer any names, and the dates you give are years away from the time the victims actually went missing, and the seasons in which you supposedly committed these murders were indeed the opposite of what you state, you know, whether there was snow on the ground or the sun was beating down on you, Dahmer had a hard time remembering. And other things, like thinking you lived in a place for a year, but in fact, as investigation would surely uncover, you only lived there for a single day. In fact, less than that. These things might raise questions about the person's ability to confess. He would completely blank out on murders he supposedly committed just weeks ago. Forgetting to mention 5, as per the new correction, 5 of his victims in a 9-hour time span where he told detectives everything he knew, only to come back the next day and begin confessing to the rest of the victims he supposedly forgot. Not sure how exactly you forget murdering someone in the same month of your arrest, but apparently Jeff did. We only have maybe an hour or 2 hours of Jeff's interviews from multiple people released to us through various sources that are edited by the media companies that release them. Jeff's initial confession with detectives, as I said, was around 9 hours. Yet that entire session went unrecorded, along with the rest of his interviews, which in total lasted over 60 hours with just these detectives alone.
You didn't tape his discussions, did you?
No, I did not.
There's no phonographic recording of them.
No, there isn't.
There is no other type of other than your typewritten notes. We have no other record of his discussions with you, Detective Kennedy, and the other officers, correct?
That's correct, other than our notes and our recollections.
Sure, I understand it. I'm not questioning that. 60 hours, you had not put down every single solitary question and answer on paper that was asked of Mr. Dahmer during that 60 hours.
No, we didn't.
Of course. You had to make judgment calls as to what was important, sufficiently important that you put it down when you thought it was. Things that weren't important, you didn't, right?
That's correct.
That's normal police procedure.
That's correct.
If the discrepancies shine through as they do in Jeff's written confession, through the selection and revision of detectives, imagine what went unrecorded. If we had full access to the tapes Wendy Patrick has had, or Lionel's personal phone calls with Jeff, or the interviews all of the forensic psychiatrists and psychologists had with Dahmer that were all recorded, what might we hear? Even Robert Ressler, who wasn't allowed to testify and who, correctly in my opinion, assumed Dahmer suffered from multiple personality disorder, had interviews with Dahmer that were recorded, but again, we only get a few minutes at most, during what was more than likely an interview that was hours long. Many had multiple interviews over many days, All of them recorded, but not the 60+ hours detectives sat with Dahmer. Not even a minute. But that, I suppose, is besides the point. What's important here is that in no way should Dahmer's confession have served to prove to anyone, least of all the detectives, that he was 100% responsible for the crimes. But of course, no one questioned it at the time, and in fact, it was so bulletproof that Boyle had no choice. He just had to file motions and skip hearings to clear the way for the insanity trial, rather than actually determining if Jeff did everything they say, and he says he did. Of course, Jeff had a chance to stop all of this. Boyle is only counsel. He cannot make decisions for Jeff. With all that we went over here, I don't think Jeff could make decisions for himself. His memory is beyond flawed, yet his defense insists upon his guilt. He requests the release of evidence just 15 days after his client's arrest. He skips the preliminary trial in which the confession would be looked over and pleads his client guilty on all charges, effectively skipping over the guilt phase of the trial. We all know what happens next.
In a hushed courtroom in Milwaukee late today, the jury rendered its decision in one of the most grisly and widely followed murder trials in modern history. The verdict: Jeffrey Dahmer was sane when he killed and dismembered men and boys in a gruesome quest for companionship and sexual gratification.
Suddenly, I could see Jeff's insanity in everything about him. It was in his motionless face, in his dull eyes, in the hard rigidity of his body, in the way his arms did not sway back and forth when he walked, even in the expressionless way he muttered, "Sorry." Soon, Dahmer would be sent off to Columbia Correctional Institution to spend hundreds of years. The amount varies for some reason, with some saying 936 and others saying 999 years. When Dahmer arrives, he is sent into solitary confinement. Boyle and others around him predicted he would die if he was sent out into the general population. Soon they would be proven right. Though Dahmer was locked away in solitary for a time, he still had his moments of human contact. He had visits with Lionel and Sherry. In May, he would actually be extradited to the county in which he killed Hicks to plead guilty on that charge as well and gain an additional life sentence. Beyond that, it seems he would stay locked in solitary, pleading to get out for quite some time. Around 1 year after his incarceration, he would grant an interview with Nancy Glass where he would talk about many things, but most notably to myself, his missing memory and the blocks he has on his mind that prevent him from acknowledging the actions he supposedly committed.
One time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. I had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here, was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And you have no memory?
I have no memory of it. But that's what started the whole spree all over again.
What was the turning point for you that made you suddenly realize that you had done something terribly wrong, something you should be sorry for?
It was the night of the arrest. I have no memory of what happened during the 6 hours before the last victim ran out of the apartment. I heard a knock on the door, and the police were there with the last victim. They asked me where the key was to the handcuffs. My mind was in a haze. I sort of pointed to the bedroom, and that's where they found the pictures. And they yelled, "Cuff him." And I was handcuffed, and it was just the realization that there was no point in trying to hide my actions anymore. The best route was to help the police identify all the victims and just make a complete confession.
Boy, does he come across as cold-blooded. Did you see any remorse?
Well, he says he's sorry, Bill, but I'm not sure he knows what that means. Tomorrow he talks about how he disassociated himself from his crimes and what lengths he went to hide them. When he confessed, he remembered every horrific detail of what he did to them, but he couldn't remember their names. Do you ever think about your victims?
I've often wondered why I haven't had more dreams or nightmares about what I've done. For some reason, it's like it's blocked off from part of my mind. If I dwelled on the subject all the time, I would I wouldn't be able to function.
In April, he was in court again, facing a civil suit from the Sentence and Phone family. In his hour-long testimony, all of which was recorded, though we once again only get a few moments edited down and released by a media company sensationalizing his crimes, he once again repeats that Conrack died right after the second injection, again going against his initial confession of strangling the boy.
Injected him with another syringe full of that dilute hydrochloric acid, and that's what killed him. I wasn't trying to kill him, but that's what happened.
Once again, if we had access to all of Dahmer's taped statements, what might we find? It's somewhere in this time, but when exactly, I'm not 100% sure, that Dahmer is released into the general population. As Boyle suggested, he wouldn't last long. When he was released into the general population, it could be presumed that Dahmer began attending the church services and would eventually end up on a work detail, but again, when exactly this starts, I have not been able to pin down. Almost a year after his civil suit, Jeff sits down with his father and Stone Phillips after Lionel has put out his own book, A Father's Story, about his perspective. In there, he makes the claims that Joyce had an over-reliance on prescription drugs, all of this in the time in which Jeff was in the womb. He detailed how she would have these fits of convulsions, and how a doctor would have to come in and physically restrain and medicate her to make Joyce relax. When asked by Stone Phillips her side of the story, and presents her with Lionel's accusation of drug abuse, he is met with complete shock.
At times, her legs would lock tightly in place, and her whole body would grow rigid and begin to tremble. During these strange seizures, her eyes would bulge like a frightened animal, and she would begin to salivate, literally frothing at the mouth.
Lionel describes a strange, undiagnosed problem. He describes it as some kind of a seizure that you developed, a proneness to seizures late in the pregnancy, where he describes it as a kind of rigidness for which you were prescribed medications. Do you remember that, and can you describe
I
it?
don't remember that at all. I can't imagine where that comes from. It isn't true. I don't.
You don't recall anything like that?
No.
Seizures or
No.
seizure-like episodes?
Absolutely not.
There's an obvious discrepancy here between what you're saying and what Lionel is saying about the nature of the pregnancy. It was difficult, you both agree, but he describes you in these states where you were, as he says, literally frothing at the mouth.
Are you serious?
The month after the interview, Jeff would be introduced to Roy Ratcliffe on April 20th, a date McGowan would have pointed out, so I will here as well. Dahmer had requested to be baptized, and though Roy was not the first contacted, he was the one that baptized Jeff. Not only that, but after they met, they would meet together weekly to study the Bible. On May 10th, 1994, 20 days after meeting Roy, Jeff would be baptized. On this same day, John Wayne Gacy would be put to death, and an annular solar eclipse would block the sun. After this, things as far as we know would be fairly normal for Jeff, for the person he was. Unbeknownst to him though, a plot was hatched 2 years ago by another man from another prison in Wisconsin who was locked up on drug charges. Doing 31 years, Osvaldo DeRuthi says he viewed it as a life sentence. Soon he saw the crimes of Dahmer on the television and watched the trial as it proceeded. He supposedly felt enraged at Dahmer and wished he would end up being sent to his prison, Walpan Correctional Institution, so he could kill Dahmer. After the trial was over and he saw Dahmer was being sent to Columbia, which was better suited to hold mentally ill prisoners, DeRuthi started to act crazy, taking pills and doing whatever he needed to do to get to the mental health unit in Columbia. After 2 whole years of this act, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Yeah, 2 years of taking drugs that weren't meant for you might do that. And so he was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in June 1994. And wouldn't you know, his cell was right next to Dahmer's. Things he learned there further infuriated him. He soon found out that Dahmer was receiving $5 grand from London monthly.
What were people saying about Dahmer, though, that 2 weeks prior? Was he hated? He was not well liked, right?
No, we are not well liked. Matter of fact, people were pissed because he was receiving $5,000 every month from people from England.
Given Osvaldo was only there for a short time, it is more than certain he learned this from other prisoners. One report from March 1994 said Dahmer did indeed receive a $5,920 donation last year from a woman in London. So Dahmer received that money at least 3 months ago from the recording of the article in March, given it is not specified where in the year this donation was made. But that is being generous. It likely happened at an earlier date in 1993. Osvaldo had arrived in June 1994, making it again at the very minimum 6 months ago if it was just before the new year that he received the donation. But again, it likely happened months before that time. Still, this news lingered in the prison that at minimum Jeff received one donation of $6,000, but Osvaldo said he was receiving $5,000 every month from people in England. Hard to tell if this claim is true. We have report for the one donation, and word could have spread and somehow it turned into Dahmer was receiving it monthly. This is supposing that a donation from what could have been well over a year ago sparked a rumor that he was receiving monthly donations of $5,000 from people in England, and it was never set straight. Regardless, Osvaldo's plan moved forward, and he soon shared this plan with another inmate who he knew previously, and they then planned together to kill Dahmer. But this plan would be foiled when, for some reason, Osvaldo was moved. He did know that Dahmer was Christian now, and he had hoped if he turned up to Sunday service, Dahmer would be there. On Sunday, July 3rd, 1994, Osvaldo rolled up his shirt with a makeshift shiv hidden inside the roll. The shiv would change descriptions multiple times over the different accounts. Still, in this supermax security prison, the shiv goes undetected after a light pat-down. Knowing he couldn't get the knife out in front of the guards, he feigns sickness to get permission to go to the bathroom. Hiding the shiv in his shoe on the way out, he sits directly behind Dahmer this time, as he was previously a few pews away. And in this small prison church, the guards didn't notice the advance upon Dahmer. He sits down, takes the shiv out, and puts Dahmer in a headlock and pushes his chin from his neck, leaving it exposed while he attempts to take Dahmer's life. This attempt fails quickly, however, after the makeshift knife breaks immediately. The man who supposedly faked being crazy and took prescription pills he didn't need for 2 whole years to get into the same prison as Dahmer, ultimately to kill him, utterly failed at doing so. Dahmer would not be so lucky on the next attempt.
Serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer is dead, murdered by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage this morning.
A Corrections Department spokesman says Dahmer and convicted killer Jesse Anderson were attacked while cleaning a recreational area at the prison. Anderson is at UW Hospital in serious condition. One of the 2 guards overseeing the 3 inmates reportedly left the area when the attack occurred. Officials aren't sure where the other guard was at the time. Dahmer was found in the staff's bathroom and shower area. Anderson was found in the prisoner's bathroom across the court.
One might wonder how such a high-profile prisoner could even be killed in a supermax prison. A prisoner who also faced an attempt on his life just a few months ago. Well, in the same exact day of Jeff's murder, just hours later, the state corrections secretary said Dahmer was not at undue risk, and he already determined the prison guards did nothing wrong.
We did not believe that Mr. Dahmer was at undue risk.
Dahmer was attacked this past July in what Sullivan calls an isolated incident. He says there's no indication Dahmer was a target or that prison guards did anything wrong.
It was also reported that the 2 inmates, that being Dahmer and Scarver, had not previously had any incidents before this day, but this would also be disputed. Now, Dahmer was found at 8:10 a.m., but the first responders received the call from the prison at 8:45.
At approximately 8:10 a.m., a correctional officer who entered the gymnasium with 2 inmates who were coming there to do recreation.
The Portage Fire Chief took a call to respond to the prison at 8:45 this morning. For firefighters Craig Ratz and Steve Dane, it seemed like a routine call. It ended up being
day I'll never forget.
The emergency response teams arrive at the prison within 5 minutes.
The entire head area looked like there was blood on both patients.
That looks pretty bad, but there is no word on what they were doing in that critical 35-minute time span. It could be they tried to render aid themselves, but as it was reported, Dahmer was so battered he was unrecognizable.
The driver of the ambulance containing one of the world's worst serial killers has no idea who he is transporting.
I didn't realize it was him until after he was unloaded at the hospital. It was the first I realized who it was.
And then how did you find out?
Walking out, exiting the building, they said, "Do you realize who that was?" And I didn't.
Surely that might warrant an immediate trip to the hospital, but who's to say? We're also told that this prison had 36 monitors to oversee the activity in the prison. And in this clip, I think we get a glimpse of their setup.
This prison has nearly 36 video monitors, electronic steel doors, yet somehow 25-year-old Christopher Scarver allegedly managed to elude the elaborate security system.
Now, we know the 2 guards who were negligent in their duty left Dahmer there alone, but the initial reports do not specify the amount of time they were alone there for. Later reporting tells of these inmates being unsupervised for 20 whole minutes, with the same secretary stating there was no irregular gap in supervision. So not only did the guards who were supposed to supervise the work detail fail in their duty, but also for 20 whole minutes the man or men stationed at the monitors didn't notice anything amiss that entire time. This would be as far as the story goes for a time, with Scarver as the main suspect, but soon one guard would give his side of the story.
This veteran Columbia Correctional Prison guard is risking all to talk to Channel 12 about what went wrong the day Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson were murdered. He says the list of mistakes is long.
Those 2 should have never been even housed in the same unit. A lot of them being assigned to the same work crew.
He states Scarver had threatened Dahmer in the past and that his threats to Dahmer were common knowledge.
This guard says it was common knowledge that Christopher Scarver had threatened Jeffrey Dahmer in the past and can't understand why they were allowed to work together.
Scarver's done a thing, you only probably got through routine of the officer. It's not that hard to do. Found an opportunity or lax part of security, went ahead and did with it.
He also gives the information that a director and 2 guards were watching over Dahmer, and they each together at the same time left the inmates unsupervised.
This guard says the day of the murders, security was lax. 2 guards and a director were assigned to the gym that day, but this guard tells us the director was in a back office. One of the guards was missing, and the second guard?
The officer in the bubble. My understanding he was damaged to the music inside the bubble. So paying attention. I guess just talking on the phone with the music and had his head down.
The man in the bubble, which I presume is the observation post, was, as he says, jamming to the music. Coincidentally, all of these men were negligent at the same exact time for 20 whole minutes. He also describes the view from the guard's perspective that was in the bubble, and to me, it sounds like the guard had a window view into the shower room where Anderson was killed, and he even says the inmate was trying to get his attention, but the guard just wasn't doing his job.
There's a lot of blood. So much as blood that there was 2 handprints on the window that looked in from the officer's control bubble into the shower room. And they were up high and they ran all the way down and full of blood all the way to the floor. And it was at least trying to get the officer's attention.
He also states Scarver walked past this guard to get to Anderson without being spotted.
He says Scarver then walked past the preoccupied officer in the control bubble to get to Anderson.
Scarver also walked back to his cell without being escorted.
Scarver then had walked past the officer again in the control bubble and returned back to his housing and stopped being escorted.
This guard also tells of 2 other inmates being held for questioning in regards to their possible involvement in the murder.
These are the men believed to have helped Scarver. Like Scarver, Roy Chester Holman and Kenneth Figures are being held in isolation and questioned about the attack.
He goes on to say these 3, Scarver, Holman, and Figures, got together the previous day in what the guard interprets as them plotting their actions for the following day.
I had a conversation for approximately half hour to an hour in depth about this, and then the next day they both showed up at recreation building. I really do believe it was planned.
But soon, Scarver would simply plead no contest. He and he alone was found guilty for Dahmer's death. In short, on November 28, 1994, Dahmer was killed along with another inmate, Jesse Anderson, after a director and 2 guards who were specifically tasked for the work detail all simultaneously abandoned their post and did so for 20 whole minutes. Those on the monitors were also somehow completely dubious for this 20-minute time span. Scarver, the man found guilty and held responsible for the attack, had twice walked past a guard in his attack on Anderson. This guard had a window view into the shower room Jesse was attacked in. Jesse also attempted to get help from said guard, but this went unnoticed. Scarver then walked back to his cell without an escort. Dahmer and Anderson were then discovered at 8:10 a.m., but an ambulance wasn't called until 8:45. When the first responders picked up the victim, they were unaware who it even was because, as they describe, Dahmer was so badly beaten he was unrecognizable. Dahmer died on his way to the hospital, and Anderson died a few days later. The same day of Dahmer's attack, the state corrections secretary already determined the prison guards did nothing wrong. Soon a panel would convene, and on this panel was none other than Dahmer's defense attorney, Gerald Boyle. This panel would conclude there was no conspiracy, but 4 guards did get suspended for their negligence. No further mention is made about the 2 other inmates held for questioning, and to this day we have no real motive for the killing. Scarver later did an interview where he made mention of behaviors that were unlike Dahmer, at least according to those who knew him best. So if the motives stated in his 2015 interview are true, is up to your discretion.
I wasn't shocked because I thought that Jeffrey Dahmer would end up this way.
Dahmer's father, Lionel, joins us now. Tell me, you told me that you were at work when your wife first called to say that your son had been injured, and then what happened after that?
Well, she had called and hit me with the news that Jeff had passed away.
In press conferences, some family members said Dahmer's murder is justice, but not all the relatives agree it is.
He was never mental, he was never sick, he was nothing but plain evil. And the evil is gone, and this is the will of God to me.
Well, I figure in the end, he's gonna pay for what he did. So it shows today that he paid for what he have did to these children out here.
Dahmer was killed and his body cremated. 2 years before his death, the Oxford was leveled and razed. 2 years after his death, and his possessions would be sold at auction and end up in the hands of a local philanthropist who immediately destroyed the entire collection. As far as we know, David is the only living member of the Dahmer family. After Jeff's crimes became national news, David changed his name and began to live in anonymity. Today, many questions still remain about the Dahmer case, and many are still unanswered. If you watched all of the documentaries on the Dahmer case, you would never come away with the information you got in this series. Some facts may overlap, of course, but where they look over discrepancies, we look deeper. And on the other side, we find an entirely new perspective, and it's from here that we can begin to see the actual shape of the case. Was Dahmer a victim of abandonment and loneliness that he had to solve by sacrificing local gay prostitutes? Or were his murders to serve an entirely different purpose? Was Jeff's altar truly part of a bizarre delusion of Dahmer's declining mental state, or was he simply following the practices of ancient religions? Was Dahmer's signs of MPD a coincidence, or was Dahmer truly suffering from this disorder and therefore faced severe abuse as a child? Did Lionel's early and deep obsession with control and his willingness to act on this urge truly subside at 12, truly reach its height when he hypnotized an unsuspecting girl from the neighborhood? Or did this deep obsession remain and have a part in Joyce's drug abuse and Jeff's condition of MPD? Did 2 of the 4 underage victims of Dahmer, all of which were prostitutes, truly work alone at the gay nightclubs without their knowledge? Or were they part of the services these nightclubs had to offer? Hosting chicken nights and having young boys live above the bar? Was Dahmer's targeting of his victims truly random? Or was there a larger reason that we are unaware of? And why were the cops so oblivious around Dahmer while also being accused of persecuting the gay and black community? How is it that every time police were in contact with Dahmer, their ability to follow protocol and use their 5 senses shut down? These are just a few of the questions that still remain and topics for future videos. But the most important question, perhaps, is did Dahmer truly act alone?
I felt that he didn't really know why he did it, but that he was sorry that he did it.
Well, that is the end of the series on Dahmer. Thank you all for watching, and thank you all for joining along. We still have plenty to do and still plenty to talk about regarding Dahmer, but also all of the other killers that will soon get their own videos. As far as I can see, I'm the only one putting out videos of this kind, but it wouldn't be possible without the groundwork laid by Patrick, who has spent years collecting a lot of the clips I use in my videos, and obviously wouldn't be possible without the work of David McGowan, who created this field of research. I would also like to shout out Josh Lamb, who helped me sort out a lot of this information when it was still new to me. And I want to thank you all for finding an interest in the channel and supporting the dissemination of this information. Still, lots to cover in the future, and I'm glad to have y'all with me along the way. If you'd like to support the channel, I have a Ko-fi page, and those are one-time donations. And I also have a Patreon, which is a monthly subscription service where I plan on putting exclusive content in the near future. Thank you for watching.
This Christmas, all that I want is world peace. But if I can't have world peace, I'd like some of those red and green M&M peanuts and a big hug. That's all.